What happens when one man tries to watch every horror movie from the 1980s? We're about to find out, because I'm Josh Spiegel and this is the 80s Project. So many decades define horror, from the Universal era in the 1930s to the sci-fi monsters of the 60s to the 70s, which gave us epics like Halloween and The Exorcist. But I'm not sure that any one decade contained as many massively influential and memorable tales of terror than the 1980s. You had the slasher wave and the rise of complicated practical effects in a time that effects artists were like rock stars. To celebrate that special time, the 80s Project is going to go year by year, outlining as many films released as we can, and we're going to kick it off by going all the way back to January of 1980. The era began on January 11th, 1980 with The Godsend, starting in a limited release and going wide 1 week later on the 18th. It was the first feature directed by Gabrielle Beaumont, who had a career that spanned into the early 2000s, but mostly stuck to TV, with her only other genre film of note being Beastmaster 3. I mean, I didn't say of extreme note, I just said note. Based on a novel from 1976 of the same name from Bernard Taylor, it's the story of a family that live out in the country that find a strange pregnant woman wandering on her own. She ends up giving birth at their house and then vanishing, causing the Marlowe family to take the little baby as their own. And as she grows, a series of accidents besets their own children. But do they just have like really bad luck, or is Bonnie something sinister? Similar to Beaumont's background, the film's cast, including Malcolm Stoddard and Sid Hamann, were mostly TV vets, although the film's most well-known presence is probably that of Angela Pleasance, daughter of Loomis, as the Stranger, although her screen time is pretty limited. It was a pretty inauspicious start to the decade, as the film is barely remembered and no real box office information exists, although I find it hard to believe that it was any sort of hit, even if the budget was a pretty small $1 million. It's not a bad way to begin the decade, but certainly a not so memorable one. My rating for the film is 2 Betamax tapes out of 5, and the horror cultural significance of it, I'm also going to give 2 out of 5 for the presence of Angela Pleasance. And should you watch it? Not really.
Look, it's her. Now perhaps you believe me.
On January 18th, the next entry was unleashed with Cardiac Arrest, although it technically had played a few places in November of '79, but '80 was when it went into wider release. It's one of only 2 films written and directed by Murray Mintz, who made this film and then basically left the film world until 1996, when he made one more film and then nothing else. It's an early slasher flick about a series of murders in San Francisco, following a couple of cops trying to solve a series of murders in which the hearts are removed, mixed with a parallel story of a married couple dealing with the revelation that the wife is in need of a heart transplant. The cast is made up of a crew of actors who mostly did character roles and very few names, even for the time, and the only face to stand out is that of Fred Ward, shortly before his star began rising in his breakout hit film Time Rider: The Adventures of Lyle Swan, but he was also very shortly in some astronaut film. Ultimately, even though this one is billed pretty heavily as a horror film, I mean, look at this poster, it's a pretty low-key detective drama. Slasher fans will be pretty disappointed, but it's pretty decent, although predictable little film with some fun characters, so it's obvious that with the rise of the slasher films, this was packaged to cash in on that. There's unfortunately very little information about the theatrical run, with no budget or box office numbers available. My rating for this one, also 2 tapes. It's okay. Horror cultural significance, 1 out of 5, because it's not horror. It's a cop drama. Should you watch it? Probably not.
Is Harvey around?
Yeah, he's in the office.
Yeah.
Leon's 2-1 pitch.
Arriving a week and a half later, the next release was January 30th, To All a Good Night. Curiously, the film is a Christmas-themed slasher, so the January debut was a little mistimed, and featured a killer Santa Claus a good 4 years before Silent Night, Deadly Night would arrive. And although that film would be met with much disdain for mixing horror and the holidays, no one was really that peeved at this one, and probably because it wasn't marketed as a Christmas film. Instead, judging from the poster, it looks more like some sort of ghost story or something, but it's actually a standard slasher set in a finishing school for girls in which a costume killer picks off our cast one by one. Interestingly, it was directed by David Hess, who most people will know as Krug from Last House on the Left, although he'll always be Swamp Thing's ferret to me. It's the only feature film that he would direct, with his only other stint behind the camera being a documentary short. The cast is mostly smaller names, like the girl from the Ghostbusters Psychic Experiment, and a group of people who mostly just starred in this film, although there's an odd cameo from 70s porn legend Harry Reams. Oddly, even though this film came out a few months before Friday the 13th, it shares several similarities. It features a crazed caretaker character named Ralph, who constantly trying to warn everybody else of danger, and the killer is revealed to be the mother of a girl who died there earlier, and she's getting revenge. It's pretty forgotten, and it's fairly deserved since it's overly predictable and just kind of plods along, but it is the genuine first slasher film of the decade. My rating for this one is 2.5 tapes, and the horror cultural significance is also 2.5 because of its Friday similarities and David Hess's contributions. Should you watch it? You can probably skip it, but it's not without its charms.
You killed my baby.
A few days later, on Friday, February 1st, we get our first heavy hitter of the era, and the only one so far to achieve any sort of longevity, and that's John Carpenter's The Fog. It was released in a few theaters around the country, but then went into broader release 1 week later on the 8th. After the huge success of Halloween, Carpenter did a couple of TV movies, and The Fog was his first theatrical follow-up, and couldn't be more different. Instead of the slasher thriller, it's a supernatural tale of angry ghost pirates who emerge from an all-encompassing fog bank. It featured Jamie Lee Curtis, of course, but also marked the theatrical debut of Carpenter's then-wife, Adrienne Barbeau, horror icon Tom Atkins, as well as Curtis's mother and Psycho star Janet Leigh, the great John Houseman, Hal Holbrook, and of course, Buck Flower. At the time, the director wasn't overly excited with his product, he didn't like the initial rough cut, and went back for reshoots, trying to make the film more comprehensible and, of course, bloodier. As more horror films were coming out that featured more gore, they realized that a quieter, subtle ghost story couldn't quite compete. It's estimated that the reshoots amount to a full 1/3 of the released version's content, and because of these reshoots, and what he considered to be lower production values, Carpenter still doesn't consider The Fog to be one of his favorite films, and the critics at the time agreed. It was unfavorably met, with the New York Times calling it constructed of random diversions and unrewarding as a ghost story. Those reviews didn't hold it back though, since it ended up pulling in $21 million at the box office against a modest budget of $1 million. Since then, the film has become more revered amongst reviewers and is considered, in the words of the director himself, a minor horror classic. My rating for this one is 3.5 tapes, since I really enjoy this one, but I will admit it's not one of my favorite Carpenter flicks. The cultural significance of it is 4, as it's early Carpenter and the atmosphere helped shape the decade. And should you watch it? Come on, you already have. If you haven't, then you know the answer by now.
Look across the water into the darkness. Look for the fog.
Not as well regarded as The Fog, but possibly more notorious, the 80s' next big release occurred on February 7th in Italy with Cannibal Holocaust. Interestingly enough, it wouldn't actually get a US release until about 5 years later, when it got a limited run in 1985. It was directed by Ruggero Deodato, who had been making films since 1964, but this is probably the work that he's the most remembered for. Although it certainly didn't invent the found footage genre, it's one of the earliest notable examples of it, and the film follows a rescue team going in search of a crew of documentary filmmakers in the Amazon, only to discover their dead bodies and film canisters. Those canisters are then turned into a film called The Green Inferno, and the footage unfurls to reveal the crew's fate. Cannibal Holocaust certainly isn't known for its quality, and is known for two major things. First is the fact that upon its release, Italian authorities charged Deodato with obscenity, and later upgraded it to murder when it was thought that the killings in the film were actually real, and that it was, in fact, a snuff film. It actually took the actors being interviewed on TV and presenting footage of them interacting with the crew after their death scenes in court to clear his name and for the courts to drop the charges. So the human deaths were faked, but the other point of notoriety is the actual killing of several animals over the course of the film. 6 animals are killed on screen, one of which was a monkey, and apparently the scene needed to be shot twice, causing them to kill 2 monkeys. It's been banned in multiple countries around the world, although it did manage to eventually get released in most of them years later, and even now, 40 some years after its release, it remains the video nasty that die-hard horror fans still have a hard time sitting through. My rating on this one is 1.5, since I think it's more notorious than notable, and frankly, not that good. And I'm not down with the animal killing. Its cultural significance is a 4, since it changed the game for Extremity, making people think that it was a snuff film, and became one of the most known video nasties and helped shape the future of found footage. Should you watch it? Sure, just be prepared to turn it off when the animal cruelty gets a bit too much.
I wonder who the real cannibals are.
The ones that are eating people. On the very same day as Cannibal Holocaust's release, another Italian terror was unleashed. Because although it was released on April 2nd in the US, Dario Argento's Inferno arrived in Italy on February 7th. This was his direct follow-up to Suspiria and served as a sequel of sorts. Although it wasn't directly linked, it was the second part of his Three Mothers trilogy, which told of 3 witches. Inferno deals with Mater Tenebrarum, or the Mother of Darkness. Although it does contain a portion of Suspiria's stylistic flares, it definitely features a more linear storyline, or at least as linear as early Argento got. The plot features a music studio from Rome who heads to New York to investigate the disappearance of his sister, only to discover a series of horrors while there, leading him to confront the villainous mother. Budgeted at $3 million US, close to double that of Suspiria, Inferno ended up only getting a limited theatrical run in the States due to a shift in management at 20th Century Fox, who handled the film's distribution. Because of this, the film made very little money at the US box office, although it was a solid hit in Italy. Critical response at the time was fairly negative as well, with most reviewers comparing it negatively to its predecessors, and Argento seems to agree. During production, he contracted a severe case of hepatitis and was forced to direct some of the scenes while lying down. Because of this experience, he's referred to Inferno as one of his least favorite of his works, unable to separate the art from the pain he went through to make it. Over time, though, its reputation seems to have increased, with it being viewed more favorably by horror fans and critics, including Total Film magazine, which declared it as one of the 50 greatest horror films of all time. One thing's for sure, though, is that it's conceivably possible that its lack of success is due to the absence of Goblin on the soundtrack. My rating is 3, since I think it looks great and it's a really fun watch, but just doesn't have the same impact as other early Argento works. The horror cultural significance is also 3, since it didn't really change the game any more than Suspiria did, but it's still Argento at the top of his game. And should you watch it? Yes, it's a wild ride, and even though it doesn't quite add up to a masterpiece, it has a lot of good stuff going on. Meanwhile, back in America, the next horror entry arrived on February 29th with Don't Answer the Phone, because 1980 was a leap year. Oddly, it starts off with a woman on the phone with her mother, but the voice on the other end really seems to be a man.
Twice.
Don't you care about your family?
Of course I care about the family.
Well, what are you going to do tonight?
Did they forget to switch out the temp sound there? This one was written and directed by Robert Hammer, and it's his only credit, save for doing some crew work on a David Crosby documentary in 2019. But he never made another movie after this one. The cast features Darkman's Polly, or Swamp Thing's Bruno, or, good old Nicholas Worth as a rapist/killer on the streets of Los Angeles, really giving a wild and demented performance.
Please consider what we discussed last week. Will you do that for me, Ramon?
But I do feel better.
There's a cameo from Porky, but it's mostly full of character performances, and this is 100% Worth's show. Well, Worth and his high-waisted jeans, like seriously, look at these things. Besides that, it's mostly notable for just how downright sleazy the whole thing is. The ads played it up as a Halloween-style babysitter stalker instead of the creepy crime thriller that it actually is. And like Cannibal Holocaust, Don't Answer the Phone was also placed on the UK's video nasty list. And like Cardiac Arrests, it's less horror than it is about the police on the hunt, although this one focuses a little more on the killer than the cops. It wasn't too well regarded upon its release and hasn't grown a more favorable reputation as time passed, with the exception of the appreciation for Worth as the killer. There's not a lot of information with respects to its theatrical run, except that it made just under $2 million in its year of release. My rating on this one is 2 tapes, since it's actually fairly dull outside of the stuff with Worth going for it, and its cultural significance is 1.5, since again it's barely horror, but there are a few slasher style moments, and should you watch it, you can skip this one.
I love the puppy. He was so sweet. He was such a little baby, and I loved him.
As we headed to March, on the 7th was the slightly more prestigious premiere of Death Ship, directed by Alan Rakoff, who has a pretty extensive directing resume, but mostly TV work, and this remains his only horror film. The cast is a bit more illustrious, with Ed Hawken, Rambo's boss, and character actor Saul Rubinek, and the plot revolves around a cruise ship rammed by a massive ghost ship, following a small group of survivors on a makeshift life raft. They all end up on a seemingly abandoned ship that was once a Nazi prison freighter and is now haunted by the ghosts of the inmate and crew. And they begin to make their presence known, haunting and possessing and exposing them to as much Nazi propaganda as Facebook. Interestingly, the ship itself that they used for filming had difficulties, and they were unable to get it to operate much, so most of the shots of the ship actually moving were accomplished by putting the camera in a small boat and driving past it to give the illusion of movement. Speaking of illusions, nothing breaks your films like accidentally getting an entire camera crew in your shot. Although the film was a Canadian and British production, costing around 4.5 million Canadian dollars to produce, and at the time the exchange was fairly similar, so it cost no less than around 4 million American, but only brought in just under 2 million at the box office, making it a disappointment, and at the time was given either negative or mixed reviews. Time has been a lot more forgiving with it though, and is looked back with a little bit more respect now, perhaps due to a persistent appearance on late 80s cable and network television mixed with a dose of nostalgia. My rating on this one is 2.5, since it has its moments, but it's really nothing new, and there's too many lulls in the action, and it's alright. The horror cultural significance is 2.5, with the presence of several genre actors. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's a good watch. There's some good tense moments. You just have to wait a little while in between them. So it turns out that 1980 was a big year for Italian cannibal pictures that partially take place in New York City, since we also saw Eaten Alive on March 20th. At least in Italy, since it wouldn't be released in America until 1985, where it did so under the title Doomed to Die. It's important to realize that this is Eaten Alive with an exclamation point, not to be confused with Tobe Hooper's earlier Eaten Alive, which didn't have an exclamation point, therefore making it scientifically 63% less exciting than this one. What makes this one exciting is that it was directed by Umberto Lenzi, schlock director extraordinaire, who we'll actually encounter again later this very year. You'll think that this was a direct knockoff of Cannibal Holocaust, especially since it features Robert Kerman, who also stars in that film and was released in several markets as Cannibal Holocaust 2, but was actually filmed before the release of that one. In fact, Lenzi is often cited as the originator of the cannibal film boom of the time, launching it with his 1972 film Man from Deep River. This one follows Sheila's search for her missing sister, last seen in the jungles of New Guinea, and she enlists a mercenary to help her find her, where they run afoul of a devious cult that they then have to escape while also avoiding the cannibal tribe that lives there. Similar to Holocaust, it features its fair share of actual animal abuse on screen, although most of it was actually reused from other cannibal movies. It wasn't well received at the time, and hasn't really improved with age, and will probably mainly be known as that other cannibal movie from 1980 that features a male porn star in the lead. My rating on this one is 1 tape, since it's just the same as some of the other cannibal stuff from that era, and I expect a little bit more from Lenzi, and its horror cultural significance is 1.5, since it'll always be in the shadows of both Cannibal Holocaust and the Hooper film. Should you watch it? Pretty much just if you're an Italian cannibal completist.
Fear not, my children. Drink, and God bless you.
March 28th closes out our first section of the year with possibly the most prestigious film on this particular list, The Changeling, directed by Peter Medic, who would follow this film up with a comedy called Zorro the Gay Blade that probably deserves its own entire video, and mostly stayed away from the horror realm, unless you count Species 2. And yes, this movie was directed by the same guy who did Species 2, and I can't get my head around that. It stars George C. Scott, and I'm pretty sure that I absolutely adore 100% of the horror work that Scott has done, and the story involves John Russell, whose wife and daughter are killed in a horrific accident, so he moves to Seattle and rents a haunted mansion. Of note is the fact that Medic was brought in at the last minute after 2 previous directors dropped out of the project due to creative differences and only had a month to revise the script to his liking and prep shooting. Given that, it's beautifully shot and incredibly well acted, and received mostly positive reviews at the time, and was considered a minor success at the box office, and actually performed better internationally than in the American market. The film was Canadian and won 8 Genie Awards, which is the Canadian equivalent of the Oscar, in the very first year that Genies were given out. It also won 2 Saturn Awards, which were given to outstanding science fiction, fantasy, and horror films, and had a solid reputation as being one of the best ghost stories of all time. It's not to be confused with the Clint Eastwood film from 2008, and should also be pointed out that Lombardo Bava had a film in 1987 called Until Death that was released in some markets as The Changeling 2, although there's no connection at all to this film. My rating on this one, to close out this section, is 4 tapes, because this one's great. It's great stuff, and Scott is fantastic. Its cultural significance is also a 4, since it's kicked the decade into elevated horror and classy haunted house tales, giving the genre a bit of respectability. So there you have it. It's the first round of films from the year 1980. My personal favorite from that lineup is The Changeling, which may be controversial, choosing that over The Fog, but it's close. If you want to let me know your favorite, you can send that to me at themovietimelinesguy@gmail.com. Also, let me know if there's one that I missed or what your personal tape ratings that you have, and we'll see you on the next episode for more of the 80s Project.